developed some questions, but knowing these folks, I suspect that the questions will go by the wayside very quickly. But we'll start with questions. The first point that Scott raised is that sufficient investment to support program delivery of the scale is needed. So, since Scott started to pick on Stu, why shouldn't I continue, right? So your question, Stu, is the research suggests that rapid upskilling, that's Scott's word, is needed if we are to avoid the negative economic consequences associated with inadequate literacy skills. What would it take for the Nova Scotia government to invest enough to eliminate any literacy skills shortages?
Define enough? I mean, when is it ever enough? From my perspective, this is an ongoing battle we will always have. It never will go away, and it was always my argument with Dennis that, because his argument to me was, if you just wait long enough, it'll all just... Sorry, maybe I just need to yell a little louder. Dennis always used to say to me that he could, he'd start to save money in the Nova Scotia School for Adult Learning after a while because it would just naturally go away. And I think that was a point that Scott alluded to earlier. And my argument was it'll never go away for the two reasons that Scott identified. One, what's coming in is always going to have some issues, and what's there is always going to atrophy over time if you don't utilize it. So Joan and I have been going back and forth over the last a month or two about how much would we need to spend in order to have every single Nova Scotian in the province have a high school diploma. It's just a marker, as a place to start. And it was quite a bit of money. Much more than I would ever be able to talk out of my minister or the cabinet. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't begin to think about how could we get there, and how could we take the money that we do have available to us, and we have some significant opportunities that have been provided by the federal government most recently to look at some of those things. My concern with Scott's presentation, while I agree with 95% of it, the one piece that I have a concern with is the idea that we would move away from A1. I don't think we could ever do that, and I would never be a proponent of that. I think that we'll always have to invest money there. Now, having said that, I think that what we will have to begin to do is think about how we are going to deliver literacy in a workplace while people are working or shortly thereafter. And we do have the Workplace Education Initiative in the province, and it's unique in Canada, but it's been a stepchild for a period of time. And I think we're going to have to look at that and say, okay, how do we bring that and what we've known as the adult education piece of it together so that we're delivering in places where people are, who are compromised, as opposed to expecting them to come to us in some mechanism, pre-formed and formal mechanism that we have in place. So I simply can't quantify the number because it's just too big for us to think about. I think effective use of the money that we have is going to be important. And part of this new investment that the federal government has made is going to require input from people in this room and some people who are not in this room, many people who are not in this room, in order for us to direct it in the most effective way that we possibly can. I was interested, I've forgotten exactly what day it was, but Jim Morrison from Michelin had an article in the paper. It was quoted in the paper, I should say. Didn't have an article in the paper, expressing a concern over the ability of people to get through the WICS test assessment that Michelin does to all workers who are applying to the Michelin process. And the failure rate was, I think he quoted somewhere 35% or so. There's a couple of people in the room that know that has come down from about 80% in the last 3 years. So he didn't get the whole story out of that. And that has resulted as a result of Workplace Education and NISAL working together around what do we do about people that are going to take the WICS. Now, the funny part about the WICS is, if you look at the profile of people who failed, they were everywhere from people who had never graduated from high school to university graduates. And what happens with the WICs is it's a time sensitive, so you get 2 hours to complete the test on 3 major components: graphing, estimation, and fractions. Now, how many folks in this room have used fractions in the last 24 hours? Okay, so they've got a bunch of smart apples in here. Most people don't. And most people don't use estimation, unless perhaps you're going through the grocery store and you want to make sure you get enough bucks at the end of the day, at the end of the cash line. And most people don't graph their work. So there are skills that we don't normally use in the run of a day. And oh, by the way, we teach them in the public school system in the elementary and junior high level, for the most part, the basics. So now we have a test in place which is testing really what people have forgotten, but which they need in the workplace. And so that problem will never go away. And how do we constantly address that? Do we bring people back every 5 years for a refresher course? Everybody in the province has to do that? No, I don't think so. So realistically, we have to be at the workplace. Let me talk about the workplace for a minute. One of the things that Scott identified was the role of the employer. On that market model that he had, we had what he had traditionally identified as our formal delivery system. That's most of the folks in the room here. But on the other side, there was workplace need, or the employer. And I think it would be fair to say that the value of learning in the employment context, in the employer context today in Nova Scotia is not very strong. Employers don't put a great deal of emphasis or a great deal of value on continuous learning and the need to upgrade skill in their workplaces. And that's not a message they like very much. And don't understand what the impact of it is. I sat with the board chair of probably one of the largest corporations in the province yesterday and talked about literacy and its impact on GDP and productivity in the workplace and profitability, because I make the connection education equals productivity equals profitability. That's my equation. And I might just as well have been talking to this microphone. No value there at all. Didn't understand why he needed to even address the issue of literacy in his workplace. So we have a lot of work to do to turn employers around. And our effort down in the valley around employer of choice is directed at beginning to work with employers to say, look, your human capital, your folks out on the floor deserve this. You require it as an employer if you want to continue to be competitive, to be productive, to be profitable going forward. You must recognize this. And I'm not even going in there and saying you need to invest money. That's going to be round 2. But at least for heaven's sakes, recognize it, that they need to invest in these things. I mean, we've had some plants go down in this province who have chosen not to invest in their capital, much less their human capital, and then sit around and wonder why. It's really quite phenomenal. And so all that to say, I have no idea what the number is. But my commitment has always been to the literacy effort, because I think it is foundational and fundamental to anything that we do in workforce development. And that's writ large from this issue all the way through the post-secondary systems. It's absolutely fundamental. And so the commitment, at least from my branch and from my department and from my minister, is to stay behind it as hard as we can.